going to be dealing with community ecology. I wanted to kind of give you an update on where we are now. We just got done talking about organismic biology. We covered the plants, we covered the invertebrates and the vertebrates. We also talked about plant biology and photosynthesis. And prior to that, we were talking about evolution of populations and DNA. So now we're going to kind of put it all together, and we're going to move into a much larger realm. We're talking about ecology, which is really defined by all organisms interacting with each other and also with the physical environment. And there are many aspects of ecology, and clearly you could take an entire course just on this subject. Here we're going to have a single lecture. Actually, we're going to follow it up with a related lecture. But if you wish to learn more about this, you should seek out an actual ecology class. It's a very interesting subject. Okay, ecology includes the study of many things. We're going to break it down just into these two here for this particular lecture. We're going to be talking about the distribution of organisms, that is, how they are situated in space and in time, and abundance. And you really can study ecology at all different kinds of levels. I'm going to give you a few examples here of levels of organization. Some ecologists focus on the species itself, focus on an individual organism, looking at genetic distinctions between organisms. You can also study populations of organisms, looking at interbreeding groups of the same species. Now, lifting it up from here, you can also study community level effects, which really looks at different species all living together and how they essentially influence the survivorship of the other. Larger than a community is an ecosystem. Ecosystems consider community level effects and also the non-living environment around them, and how the non-living environment influences the distribution and also the abundance of those organisms. Now, if you lump many ecosystems together, you'll get to the biome level. And biomes look at major assemblages of organisms over very large geographic areas. And of course, the largest level of organization in ecology that you can study is the biosphere. Biosphere essentially looks at global level phenomena and basically how organisms interact on the biosphere on the global level. Okay, so let's come back to something very specific that is important in how populations grow. Reproduction. Reproduction is essential for all organisms. And all organisms have the capacity to reproduce. Well, of course they do, otherwise they wouldn't be here. So populations tend to grow, and there are several factors that actually affect whether a population is either in a growth phase or in a shrinking or declining phase of population. And those factors that control that are known as life history characteristics. Now, it would be really great to put all of the energy that you have into your reproductive effort, in your ability to survive, put effort into how well you can take care of your offspring, how many offspring you can have. Unfortunately, that's unrealistic. You can't put your energy into all of those things because you only have a finite amount of energy. No matter how many lion babies a lion would like to have, because there is only a finite amount of resources, they can only put so much energy into future babies, into their progeny. Well, that's true of pretty much all organisms on the planet. So there are trade-offs that occur as a result of this. Since you only have a fixed or finite amount of energy to work with and matter to work with, you essentially have to establish where you're going to be putting more of your emphasis, and there's no right or wrong answer to this. It really is just species specific. Let me give you a great example. At the top picture here, you're looking at a dandelion. This is an organism that has put most of its energy into the reproduction of many, many, many propagules that get spread out on the wind. How many of these are actually going to survive? Probably not many of them, but at least one or two will, and that's good enough. Okay, so this is putting your finite amount of energy into producing a huge number of offspring, spreading them all out there, knowing full well that only a few are going to make it. Versus a coconut palm, which produces a whole lot fewer progeny here. So you have far fewer coconuts on this tree than you have dandelion propagules here. And because you have fewer offspring here, you're able to put a greater amount of resource into the quality of your offspring. So while only a few dandelions will survive, a much greater number of these coconut palms are actually going to make it, these actual seeds here, when they make it to a distant shore and begin to grow. So another characteristic of populations is their distribution or dispersion in the environment. And there are three different patterns of distribution that populations exhibit in nature. And, they are controlled. This distribution is going to be controlled by biotic factors. Biotic means biological in nature. So, for example, interactions of organisms, one animal eating another, one animal evading another animal. Those are biological processes. But that dispersion is also going to be controlled by non-living or abiotic resources. Again, you see an A in front of a word in science, it means not having it or not associated with it. So an abiotic factor would be things like temperature, moisture, saltiness, all of that. Those are things that have nothing to do with biology, but will certainly affect the distribution of an animal or a plant. I'm showing you three distributions here of plants, and the first one here is a clumped distribution. That's this one here at the top. This is a clumped distribution where you have lots of individuals kind of all aggregating together, and in between these aggregations you have a lot of empty space. Okay, so that's a clump distribution. Then there's a random distribution right here. This one is random. In other words, these organisms are distributed over a desert floor kind of in a way that is irrelevant to where all other animals are located. They're simply randomly distributed throughout that area. This bottom one here is a uniform or even distribution, and the term regular distribution is also used. That's why I kind of put all three of these words here together, because all three kind of mean the same thing: regular, uniform, or even. And it's interesting kind of what factors control this distribution, because this bush up here, which is seen at the top, is known as creosote bush. Creosote is very common in our deserts, and if you were driving from here to Phoenix or from here to Las Vegas, when you get out into that desert, that's what you'd see, lots and lots of creosote bush. Well, when creosote bush are very, very small, when they are basically new propagules, their seeds have basically given rise to very small little plants, they tend to clump together. That is, they tend to grow up where conditions are good. Obviously, the propagules that are over here are not going to make it. Maybe there isn't enough water, or maybe there's too much sunlight. Whatever the factor is, whatever abiotic factor is affecting them, when they first emerge, they have this clumped distribution. Now, as these organisms mature, they begin to take on a more random pattern. And this is because they're essentially, they're not competing for resources. They're simply putting their roots down, trying to get as much water as they can. Some are living, some are dying. But once they get to be mature plants, that is, those that were not fit to survive have already died off, and those that are in really good shape begin to really dominate the area around them. They start sticking their roots out and dominating even below the surface of the desert floor those water resources. Anywhere where roots are going to be overlapping between two plants, there's going to be competition, and one's going to win and the other's going to lose. So it's interesting that when competition, which is a biotic factor, when competition between species takes over, it ends up with a uniform or regular or even distribution here. So that's very interesting. Okay, another characteristic of populations is growth rate. How do populations grow? Well, we need to determine what is it that we're talking about when a population is growing. Okay, some of it's obvious, but others are not quite so obvious. So let's say you have a population of birds here in the middle. The population would be growing if you had additional births, right? So babies, bringing babies into this population is going to add to the population. However, immigration is also going to add to it. Let's say that you have individuals from the same species but coming from a different population coming in. Well, your population is going to grow. Likewise, what would cause a population to shrink would be, for example, deaths. So as birds are being born, you also have birds over here that are dying from the population. And you also have emigration, which is the opposite of immigration. You have individuals from your population leaving and going to another population. Okay, so these are the general factors that control the growth of a population. Births and deaths, and immigration and emigration. Okay, and when you look at the growth of a population theoretically, numbers tend to increase very rapidly, at least initially, in what's called a J curve. So if you have, for example, this is an arithmetic increase where something, as time goes on, it's just increasing incrementally by the exact same amount each year. Okay, populations basically do not grow that way. Instead, populations grow geometrically, at least early on, where, if you were to plot it out and say, okay, one animal is going to divide and make two animals become four animals become eight, and eight becomes 16. If you were to plot that over the same period of time, it would look like this orange curve, which is called a J curve. It's a geometric increase in population. And now I'm going to not try to overwhelm you here with math and mathematical equations, but I am going to show you two here in this lecture, just two, and it's going to be rather easy. Don't get scared. Don't get scared. I'm going to talk you through this. This is a very simple equation which describes that geometric increase, that exponential growth. Okay, now the growth rate is this R right over here. Okay, what's the growth rate? The rate is equal to the terms that I just introduced you to. The births, how many babies are you creating, minus how many deaths are there. Okay, if there's more births than deaths, well then the rate increases. If there's more deaths than births, then the rate decreases. But don't forget to add immigration minus emigration. So that's what this R is over here. It's births minus deaths plus immigration minus emigration. That's the rate of growth. And you're going to multiply that times this number here, n. N is your population size. Let's say you have 100 individuals and you're growing at a rate of 0.1, then it would be 100 times 0.1, which actually would be a population decrease. Okay? And here's how we define these things. Now this is called a calculus equation here. But we're not doing calculus here, but I'm just going to explain to you what these mean. dn is the change in population. Little d stands for change. So a change in population over a change in time. So how is the population changing over time? It's changing by the growth rate times the population size. You got a population, you multiply it times a growth rate, and you get the population at some point in the future, either bigger or smaller or the same. Okay? Now this equation is really important, and in fact, if you are a financial or economy kind of guy, economics kind of person, you might recognize this equation because it's actually used for investments and stuff like that. So this is actually kind of important. We're looking at doubling times now. How much does a population double over time? Let's see. Does it double over 10 years? Does it double over 5 years? Does it double over 100 years? Well, if you know the actual growth rate, that is the annual increase in percentage, you can actually predict how long it will take for a population to double. And it turns out, and this is actually something that you should know if you're an investor, is that if your annual increase rate is 10%, that is to say, if you are earning a 10% return on your investment, then it's going to double in 7 years. Okay? If your annual increase is only 2%, then it will take you 35 years to double your earnings. If you are increasing at 1%, well then it's essentially 70 years. Okay, for your investment to double. That's the same thing too with population sizes. If it's growing, if that R is at a rate of 1.0, well then it will take 70 years for it to double. Okay, so 70 per annual percentage growth rate. That's kind of what that means. So, for example, if a wombat, and that's what these two animals here are, if a wombat grew at 5% per year, how long until the population doubles? Okay, can you figure that one out? If you said 14 years, then you got that question right, and you'll get this question right on the final exam. All right, congratulations. Moving on. So populations tend to grow. And I want to use houseflies as a great example. Look at this number. If an average housefly was laying 120 eggs per generation, and keep in mind, these flies actually mature rather quickly, 56 days to mature. Isn't that amazing? It means that after 1 year, if all of the flies survived and ended up reproducing themselves, this is how many flies you would end up with. That's a huge, huge number. And so the question is, do populations really do this? When a housefly produces 120 eggs, do they all live? And if they all live, do all of their babies live from your original propagule? Okay, can populations grow indefinitely? That's our question. And the answer, of course, is no. Populations cannot grow indefinitely. Something, some sort of a factor, is going to reduce the reproductive rate or increase mortality. That is to say, at some point, your rate of production of babies is going to slow, or your rate of increase of some factor that causes death is going to increase. Okay, so there's really two models that I want you to compare here. This is the original growth model, the exponential growth model that we were looking at. This was assuming that populations are just going to grow and skyrocket and you're never going to have anything affecting that population. This is not normal in nature. You don't tend to have organisms growing exponentially, at least not for very long. Eventually, factors take over and the population begins to look more like this blue one here. It actually slows down and eventually it asymptotes out. It actually goes to a flat line of growth. Now, does this mean that the population has stopped growing? Well, kind of. What it means is the number of births is exactly equal to the number of deaths. That is, the environment, the population, is being sustained exactly by the environment. As many mouths as are coming into the population to have to feed, that's how many mouths are leaving because of death or emigration. Okay? This growth model here that slows to a carrying capacity is called logistic growth. So that carrying capacity, whatever level that is over here, is the level, the population size, that can be sustained by the environment. Okay, do we see both growth models? Actually, yes, we do. Exponential growth does happen. It just does not persist indefinitely. Eventually, it gives up. It has to give way to logistic growth. But we still do see it. Here's an example of a tree, and over 500 years, if you're looking simply at pollen grain accumulation, you see that this tree has been shown over the last 500 years to be growing exponentially. Clearly, it's not going to continue to do that, but at least in this 500-year span, it is. Whereas if we come over here to this fur seal, it initially begins to grow exponentially, right? So that's the lower half here. But as it continues to grow, that growth begins to slow and asymptote out until it reaches a flat line, which is somewhere around here, 10,000 breeding male fur seals. Okay, that is an example of logistic growth. Over here is exponential growth, and this is logistic growth. Okay, let me talk a little bit about that carrying capacity again. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals in that population that can be supported by the environmental conditions in which they exist. The amount of food obviously is going to dictate that, how much space there is, how many predators there are. Lots of things actually control the carrying capacity. Now, logistic growth, that controlling growth, is just a simplification of how most populations actually behave when they approach that carrying capacity. Let me show you an example. So logistic growth certainly does happen. Okay, we do see it, but most organisms behave in a way that's a slight complication of logistic growth. We call it Malthusian growth. growth. Okay, so let me show you real quickly an example of logistic growth, and then I'm going to explain Malthusian growth. Okay, logistic growth. This is that typical growth rate, that S-shaped curve, where the growth is actually regulated, and the population ends up falling into some sort of equilibrium with the resources around it. And the term that we give to a carrying capacity is K. K, the letter K, that stands for our carrying capacity in logistic growth, producing this S-shaped curve. Okay, it looks kind of like this. Here's that J curve, and here's our S curve, which is logistic growth, that S curve. And that carrying capacity here, where that dotted line hits this y-axis on the amount of population you can actually have, that, where the mouse pointer is right now, that is K, your carrying capacity. So if we take our original exponential growth equation, remember that equation, Rn? Okay, but now we have to complicate it a little bit to explain logistic growth. Okay, again, don't get scared. This is just the second and only other equation I will show you in this class. Okay? You already recognize some of it. You recognize this over here. The change in population over the change in time. Here's our intrinsic rate of increase, right? The maximum per capita rate of increase. But we're now adding a carrying capacity, and also we're adding another representation here of the population size. Okay? That's all that means. That's the addition there. And what it means is when your population is way down here, let's say you're at the bottom of the curve, it means that n is very small, right? Relative to k. So k is big, n is small down here. Well, when k is a big number and n is really, really, really small, okay? So let's make n very, very small. It's effectively still just k over k because you're not taking much away from k here. It effectively is k over k. What's k over k mathematically? It's 1. So when the population is very, very small, you have 1 times Rn. In other words, down here, growth proceeds just like exponential growth. Okay? However, let's get way up here, where our population size is essentially the same as the carrying capacity. Well, if n is the same as k, then even if we threw numbers out here, let's say the carrying capacity is 10,000, but the population is 10,000 too. Well, what's 10,000 minus 10,000? It's 0. 0 over k is 0. This whole thing drops to 0. In other words, the growth rate in population over time when you're up here is 0. So it's going to range between 1 and 0. That's essentially what this is over here. And that's how logistic growth works. Yes, some populations actually exhibit that. Here is the growth of a paramecium, a little single-celled animal living in a petri dish. As you start out with only a few individuals, they essentially grow exponentially over time until they hit some carrying capacity. Okay, you kind of see that. Now I want you to notice something about the dots here, though. You notice that the dots are not right on this line. They go above it, and then below it, and then above it, and then below it. That's because populations tend not to grow perfectly like this line, but they actually oscillate around that carrying capacity. Okay? Now, the person who really observed this and formalized this was a guy by the name of Malthus. Yes, we actually mentioned Malthus earlier when we were talking about Darwin. Okay, so we're going to bring in another Malthus idea here. He said that populations tend to explode followed by population crashes. And he actually believed that the human population was going to be growing so rapidly that it was going to exhaust all the resources, and when it crashed, it was going to be really, really bad. And this was actually justification for him to suggest to the King of England that population control might be in order. Well, clearly that's a very controversial thing. But the principle of what Malthus was talking about from a biological standpoint makes actually kind of sense. Here you have your exponential growth, but then you have essentially a return to the carrying capacity. If you overshoot the carrying capacity, well, now your population size is bigger than the carrying capacity, and your growth rate actually becomes negative, and you shoot down. But you don't stop there. You usually oscillate around it. It's a constant returning around that carrying capacity. And so this is what happens when a population grows too fast. So again, if you were to have a more detailed view of how a population grows, you will notice that there are overshoots, where it goes beyond the carrying capacity, followed by diebacks, which is essentially negative growth. And severe diebacks, if you have a severe dieback, if it's possible for you to go way beyond that carrying capacity, what kind of a dieback could you observe? It could be really bad, right? It could even be extinction. That would be bad. Okay, but here's a typical case of population dieback and that Malthusian growth, which is simply, look, logistic growth, right? But that it's oscillating around that carrying capacity, okay? So now let's turn it over to another topic, demographics and population growth. If we are going to observe populations and how they grow, we have to actually pay attention to a few things about them. And survivorship is one of them. And if you went out and you were to measure the gophers, for example, at Santa Ana College, and you were to observe all of the gophers that were alive today and had some way to tag them, okay, put a little radio tag around their necks, and you did that with 1,000 individuals on the Santa Ana College campus, and you observed those over the next 3 or 4 years, you could actually watch as they die how much of a particular generation stays around. And that's really useful information. And we can use that information and form what's called a life table and also a survivorship curve. And there are really 3 different ways that populations tend to survive, and it is very closely related to how well they take care of their offspring, the quality of their offspring, and lots of other factors. Let me show you what a type 1, type 2, and type 3 curve look like. We actually fit in one of these, but a type 1 curve is where you have lots of individuals in that tagged population of 1,000 that survive all the way to old age. Very few of the young ones actually die. They actually make it all the way to old age, and they don't start dying off until old age. Type 2 is where the death is pretty much spread all the way across all age groups. Doesn't matter what age you are, your rate of dying is going to be the same whether you're young or whether you're old. Type 3 curves, or type 3 survivorship curves, are when the majority of the death actually occurs in the young. But if they can manage to make it past that young stage, then they tend to survive very well. Okay, so let me show you an example of all 3 of these. Okay, and again, you can do this by simply tracking individuals, in this case a ram. So you look at rams, 1,000 of them, and they, at the end of year 1, you've tracked them all, but from year 1 to year 2, there's only 801 of them remaining. That means between year 1 and year 2, 199 individuals died. Between year 2 and year 3, 12 individuals died. And then 13 individuals died from year 3 to year 4. And so we can track this until there are no more remaining. After 15 years, all 1,000 that we started with are now no longer here. And we can plot that information. And when you plot it, you find that they're going to fit one of these 3 curves. Here's that type 1 curve where most of the death is experienced at the end of the life of the organism, at the end of the lifespan, I should say. Type 3 is where the majority of death occurs at the beginning of that lifespan. And then type 2, that intermediate case, where it is irrespective of the age of the organism, the death rate's still going to be basically the same. Humans are in a type 1 curve, okay? But green sea turtles are like this oyster here. They give birth to gazillions of little tiny babies, the vast majority of which never make it past their first birthday. But if they manage to make it past year 4 or 5 or 6, well, then their chances of survival happen to be actually really good. So, a green sea turtle, like an oyster, is an example of a type 3 organism. And this hydra here would be an example of a type 2 organism, where it doesn't matter how old the hydra is, its chances of dying are going to be the same no matter what. Okay, now what is going to affect the growth of a population, or the shrinking of a population? Remember, it's resources, but it's also other things, it turns out. There are some factors that regulate the growth of that population. We call these factors density independent factors. These are things that control a population size regardless of how big the population actually is. An example are things that you can't control: weather, geologic events like volcanic eruptions, tsunamis, these sorts of things. And the second variety are density dependent effects, where the controlling effect, is greatly influenced by how big the population is. The bigger the population, the greater the influence that that factor has. Let me give you a good example of that. Okay. Now, an example of a density independent effect would be like this. Take a look at this. Let's say you have a small population. You have 5 individuals here. And of these 5 individuals, all of a sudden a deluge comes down and a river washes away 3 of your 5 individuals. Well, that's a 60% mortality rate. That's a lot of individuals dying. But the funny thing is, well, I guess it's not that funny, the ironic thing is that even when you have a large population, like this amount of individuals, that exact same river comes rushing through there, and it ends up killing proportionally the same amount, 60%. Notice these are the same. Well, that is a death rate that is the same whether you have a small population or a large population. That's an example of density independent effects. You're going to get the same mortality rate regardless of whether you have a small or a large population. Now, a density dependent factor would be something like this, where it actually depends on the population size, and these are usually biologic factors. For example, competition. The more of 2 species that you have that are competing for resources, the greater that competition becomes, and it actually ends up hurting one population or the other. Predation is also something that is affected by the population size. I'm going to show you that in just a second here. And finally, disease. Diseases spread better when population sizes are large. They spread less well when population sizes are small. So these are 3 things that are density dependent. That is, the effect they have in controlling a population's size is determined by how dense the population actually is. Here's a good example. Okay, let's look at density dependence. In this case, we've got 7 holes. 7 holes for 4 birds to live in. All right, well, when this population is small, there's basically no impact on the availability of houses, okay, because there's more houses than there are birds. However, when there's more birds than there are houses, now there's huge competition between all these birds for who gets to have the house. These guys left out here are now basically predator food. Okay, so this is a density dependent effect. Small amounts of birds, very little effect. Large amount of birds, huge effect. Okay, now so that's competition. What about predator prey densities? Well, when there's only a few prey, a predator has to do a lot of searching, right? They're out there searching a lot and they're not catching very many. So there's low prey mortality here, percentage wise. But when they get plentiful, now there's lots of prey, the predator doesn't have to search as much and ends up catching a whole lot more and ends up producing a much greater impact in mortality on its prey species. So this is another example of density dependent factors. Another good example here is the presence of predators in the intertidal zone. What you're looking at are sea stars that are doing an effective job of controlling these mussels up here in the mussel mats. Mussels get very plentiful very quickly. However, they are controlled. Their population is controlled by the presence of these sea stars. The more mussels there are, the greater sea stars, or the greater the sea stars' effect will be in controlling their population. What's really interesting, too, is that predator and prey populations respond to each other. So it's not just the predator that's controlling the prey population. If there aren't enough prey, the predator population begins to suffer, too. So they actually control each other. What you're looking at here is a lynx and a snowshoe hare. These are 2 animals that are locked together in a predator-prey interaction and have been for probably hundreds of thousands, if not even millions of years. Predator-prey oscillations are essentially what occurs when a predator and a prey's population sizes cycle as a result of the other, so they oscillate. When the prey population begins to rise, the predator population begins to rise, thus imparting more effect on the predator. But when the predator's population falls as a result of the increased predator pressure, then the predators eventually drop as well. And this is a graph here showing the oscillation of snowshoe hares and lynx populations from 1850 till about, let's see, about 1940 or so. And where do we get these data from? Well, we get them from trapper data. So trappers from 1850s on were keeping track of what they were trapping. And in some years, they were able to trap lots of snowshoe hares, but in those years, they weren't getting very many lynx, and vice versa. So they tended to kind of oscillate around each other. Now, life history adaptations favor one versus the other. Do you remember when we talked about the difference between dandelions and coconut palms? Okay, so in one case, one organism put all of its effort into growing huge amounts of propagules that, probably many of which won't make it, versus putting more effort into a smaller number and increasing the amount that do make it. Well, actually, that can be played out here in our logistic growth model. Some species tend to favor this R part of the model. That is, they start to favor maximum growth, whereas other species emphasize this K part of the model, that is, the carrying capacity. So what are some examples of R-selected versus K-selected animals? Well, if you're an R-selected animal, it means you're the kind of animal that takes advantage of rapid growth. If you are a K-selected animal, then you're the kind of animal that takes advantage of your population being large in size, and you can put more emphasis in growth and survivorship of smaller numbers of individuals. So as an example here, I've actually spelled them out. These are other ways of looking at it. An R-selected animal is an opportunistic animal. It favors the exponential growth part of logistic growth, that bottom part of the curve. They tend to be smaller organisms. They tend to mature earlier in life. They don't have a very long lifespan, and they have limited, if not non-existent, parental care. These organisms also tend to take advantage of the resources only when they're available, so their resources are usually spottily available. K-selected organisms, on the other hand, they are the ones that tend to exhibit the full range of logistic growth. Basically, their population sizes are very near carrying capacity. They tend to be larger organisms that live a very long time, and usually they tend to have lots of parental care of their offspring, thus increasing the potential for their offspring to survive. So this is an example of an opportunist population, like the dandelions we showed you before, and this is an example of an equilibrium population, or one that is a K-selected organism. K-selected meaning an equilibrium population. Now, we've talked a little bit about population growth here. We've talked about the factors that control it. Now let's take it to somewhere a little more personal. Population growth. How does the human population behave as far as growth is concerned? Okay, where was the human population 10,000 years ago? Well, 10,000 years ago, there were only 2 million humans on the planet. That doesn't sound like all that much. In the city of Los Angeles, for example, there are currently 10 million people just in the city of Los Angeles. So that's 2 million, not very many. 10,000 years ago, though. So human population growth was pretty darn slow for the vast majority of human history. However, there has been a very recent explosion, and let me talk a little bit about the factors that controlled that explosion. For all intents and purposes, the recent explosion was simply technology-based, and that technology, that explosion in our knowledge of how technology works, has allowed us to increase in these 3 areas here. Our ability for agriculture, and having agriculture allowed us to support much larger populations. Medicine has kept us healthy, and in one sense, the agriculture side of things increases our ability to give birth, to have more organisms added to our population. But the medicine issue actually does something different. Instead of supporting births, what it does is it actually prevents deaths. So in one sense, we are increasing our births over here and also decreasing our deaths. And hygiene is another one, basically understanding how diseases spread in the human population. And all you need to do is wash your hands, and heck, that does a whole lot for survivorship. So we have one here that's controlling or actually increasing our growth, and we have two factors here that are decreasing our deaths. And in so doing, an amazing thing has happened. Here I am now showing you a graph of human population growth. You can see that it's been pretty stable. I mean, we've kind of been going up and down a little bit here, just a little bit, and we even had a little dip right about here. And this small dip was actually due to the bubonic plague, when essentially a third of all of Europe was affected. But that was the last time that human populations have actually dropped in numbers. In fact, the human population, I have to increase the axis here, because this is actually what's happening. You see, in 1800, that's when we hit our first 1 billion people. 1 billion. 10,000 years to reach 1 billion people in 1800. Now, to continue on with this, we're going to have to add, yes, to that y-axis. In 1930, only 130 years after 1800, we hit our second billion people. 30 years after that, our third billion. 15 years later, in 1975, 4 billion. 1987, we're talking 12 years after that, 5 billion. 1999, 6 billion. And guess what, folks? October 31st of 2011, we hit 7 billion people. That's right. We are now essentially adding 1 billion people to this planet every 12 years. And it seems to be slowing just a little bit. But by 2025, it is expected that we will be hitting 8 billion people. How many of you expect to be around in 2025? I hope you all expect to be around at that time. But think about where we're at here. When were you born? What year were you born? If you were born in the mid-80s, for example, there were only 5 billion people on the planet. You are now competing against 2 billion more people than you were back then. If you were born in the mid-70s, then it means that you are actually competing with 3 billion more people than were on the planet when you were born. Okay, that's really, really important to think about, because it really comes down to where are we going, right? I mean, ultimately, can we keep growing this way? Right? What could possibly happen? Well, you might think, wow, if we're way beyond our carrying capacity, is it possible that our population could crash? Well, it already has. Let me show you. This is Rapa Nui. Now, we're not talking about a global crash here. We're talking about a population that lived on a remote island called Rapa Nui. Rapa Nui is also known as Easter Island. Okay, and those statues in the last picture are known as moai statues, and the moai are essentially carvings, and they are carvings of the human face. Let me go back now, facing outwards towards the ocean. Basically, this was a last-ditch effort by these people who essentially are, for all intents and purposes, extinct. A last-ditch effort to reach out to their gods to try and help them with the major problems that they were facing. As their small band of people, their small population, began to grow and grow and grow, overpopulation began to take effect. And with overpopulation, these things come about. You're going to recognize some of it because they actually pertain to many populations around the world today. Tribal warfares, religious superstitions, habitat destruction, famine, and disease. Okay, all of these things become worse because of overpopulation, which is precisely what happened to the Easter Islanders. The Easter Islanders began to essentially kill each other off, and one of their religious rituals was to carve these huge statues out of the hillside and roll them down by cutting down their trees and using the rolling logs to move their their statues into place. But in so doing, in that religious superstition desperation, they essentially cut down all the trees on their entire island. This picture I'm showing you is actually not Easter Island. This picture is from Hawaii. It is probably what Easter Island looked like before the Easter Islanders, the Polynesian Easter Islanders, got there. This is what Easter Island actually looks like today. There is not a single tree on Easter Island that's more than 50 years old. They've all been cut down. And the Easter Islanders essentially went away and went extinct because they overutilized their resources. They essentially stripped their environment of all it had to offer and until it couldn't give any more, and they simply died out. Now, is this a simple, individual case? Nope, it's exactly what happened to the Anasazi. It happened to the Incan Empire, the Egyptian Empire, you name it. Every human society that has failed in the last 2,000 to 3,000 years has done so because of destruction of habitat and destruction of the natural environment around them. That's a topic that we're going to get into a little bit later in one of the remaining lectures. Now, what about the human population? Are we densely packed? Well, yes, we are. There are certain places where we are clumped. And also, what's even worse with this clumping is that we have certain countries that are very well developed. We're going to call them more developed countries versus less developed countries. And less developed countries are faced with really, really grave problems. And you can see these problems in what's called their age structure of those countries. Age structure can actually indicate very important population characteristics. Let's go ahead and start with the more developed countries. A more developed country, which is kind of like the U.S., but more like Switzerland or Japan. These countries are essentially only replacing themselves, or actually they, in some cases, are actually shrinking. This graph here is an age structure graph that is comparing the distribution of that population that fall into these different age categories. And you'll notice that for the most part, there is more or less an equal number of individuals that are young versus working age versus old age. And over here you've got your dependent individuals that are dependent on the working force here, the reproductively viable working force, and also a smaller number of, or an evenly distributed number of retirees, let's say. Okay? Let's take a look at the lesser developed countries. This is what their age structure looks like. The number of dependent individuals here greatly outnumbers the reproductively viable working class, and there is a shrinking amount of retirees here. So this pyramid, remember, these individuals down here are eventually, as they continue to grow up, going to become this one right over here. This is a population that is doomed to failure. And it falls into, or I should say, the countries that fall into this category would be a lot of nations throughout Africa. So there is a population crisis that is looming right now, and it is not going to only be confined to the borders of Africa. This is going to become a world issue, and we need to deal with it ASAP and help those countries deal with this inverted pyramid, essentially, or this pyramid of growth. Okay, so what type of strain do 7 billion people put on the environment? It's huge. Think about all the resources that you and I use on a daily basis. Food. Humans only occupy about 17% of Earth's surface. That's primarily because most of Earth's surface is ocean. Of that 17%, only 4% is actually farmable. That 4% farmable land is not increasing in size, and yet the human population is. Okay, when those two problems clash, it's going to be a serious issue. Natural resources. We use all kinds of natural resources, including wood, land, and water. Wood and water actually can replenish themselves, but in many places and in many cases, we are utilizing those resources faster than they can replenish themselves. Then there's energy issues. With more people and more technology, means more energy demand. And then there's, of course, the waste removal. All of that waste that we create with more people, that's more waste. That's a greater need to deal with it or to take care of it. Now, from the census information from 2010, this is currently where we're at in our world. China leads the world in population with over a billion people just in China, 1.3 billion, 1.2 billion in India. And guess what? The United States, we like to consider ourselves kind of on top of the world here, but the reality is of every industrialized nation, we have the largest population of all industrialized nations. So we are part of the problem. Well, actually, we're more than part of the problem, and we'll explain that a little more in an upcoming lecture. This is likely going to change by 2050. India is likely going to take over. Why? Well, because China has actually implemented a very drastic population control method of only allowing one child per family. This has created a lot of other social problems, but one of the effects is that their population is growing more slowly than that of India or even that of the United States. Now, this was the world population as of this week. It was at 7,9,781,914. I want you to check this website right here, and you will see this number will continue to grow as the semester goes on. Keep track of it. Check it next year and the year after that. It'll be very interesting to see what happens. Okay, now we're going to be adding about 1 billion people to the planet every 12 years. Okay, and this is going to create some serious problems that you now understand more about because you've been introduced to ecology. The next lecture is going to look at ecology in even greater detail, and that's coming up. So I will see you all in cyberspace.